Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadan Ashraf al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen wa ala alihi al-Tayyibin al-Tahirin wa sahabatihi al-Akrameen wa tabi'ina lahum bi ihsan ila yawm al-din wa alayna ma'ahum wa fihim bi rahmatika ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Inshallah, we're going to be looking at that which is known as the Ma'asi al-Qalb. And this Arabic word asa ya'si is to disobey, it's to sin. And so these are the ma'asi of the qalb, are the sins of the heart. And unfortunately that we hear oftentimes about various types of sins that can be committed outwardly, that we tend to neglect, and oftentimes the discourse in that our Islamic centers and in our mosques neglects the various sins that pertain to the heart. Every single one of us, that if we would have filth on our body outwardly, that we would be very troubled until that we had the ability to wash it off. But we tend to forget that there is also filth that stains the heart, that must be cleansed and purified. And the proof of that is the words of Allah Tada, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجِسٌ. Then indeed that the polytheists are impure. It doesn't mean that they are physically impure or that they have some type of outward impurity that on their skin. It means is that impurities by way of belief. And we also tend to forget that tazkiyah, that is a process of purification, is one of the four fundamental duties of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As Allah Ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, كَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا فِيكُمْ رَسُولًا مِنْكُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْكُمْ آيَاتِنَا وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمْ مَا لَمْ تَكُونُوا تَعْلَمُونَ. He says, and just as that we have sent among you a messenger from you, that he recites our signs, our revelation to you, and he purifies you. وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ, and he purifies you. And then he goes on, Allah says, and he teaches you the book and the wisdom. And so the ulama have looked at this verse and others that are similar in wording and have spoken of the fundamental duties of our Prophet ﷺ being four, is to recite the book and to purify in all the meanings we'll speak about in detail about these four things, to teach the Quran, and then to also teach the wisdom, which is the sunnah, the practical application, if you will, according to one interpretation. In other words, is that the first dimension of this is the interaction with the Prophet ﷺ. Yatlu alaykum. He recites to you, ayatina, our revelation. And so that it's indicative of interactions and human interactions with Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And this points to the importance of being with living that links in the chain. And that learning is a process. Yes, the internet is a band-aid at times when people cannot be physically present, but it doesn't replace the importance of in-person talaqqi, that learning and taking from true scholars. And so, and if you even look before, you also have something in this verse that in the Quran is very subtle. The words that are chosen, كَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا فِيكُمْ رَسُولًا مِنْكُمْ. Thus, just as we have sent that fikum, amongst you, rasulan minkum, literally a prophet from you, meaning that he was one that from Bani Adam, he was from the children of Adam, that he wasn't an angel, for instance. He was a human being. So the Prophet had a human side so that we could relate to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he was not like other human beings. He received revelation. However, that he was also, the second meaning of that would be is that this was a primary address to the Arabs that the Prophet was initially sent to. The majority of the companions were Arabs, and then from there that spread all throughout the world, even though he had a universal message, is that he was known, that they knew his lineage, that they knew his father and his grandfather, and they knew that where he came from, so he wasn't foreign to them. So in all of these meanings, but again, that there's this idea of nearness, being with people. And then yatlu alaykum, he recites to you. And literally alaykum, upon you. So you are there in a passive sense, that being recipients of this transmission. And this is extremely important, because is that when our Prophet used to recite sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that he used to have what was called a qira'ah mufassirah, that his recitation itself sallallahu alayhi wasallam would explain the Quran. It would comment upon the Quran. And those that were there listening to the Prophet recite sallallahu alayhi wasallam, is that it would happen that they would come to understand meanings of the Quran just by virtue of the Prophet's recitation. There's an outward dimension and an inward dimension, both of which remain with us to this very day and age. Is that the masters of tajweed, that is the art of Quranic recitation, they know when to pause, and they know when to emphasize, and they know what verses to repeat, and they know where to properly stop, and all of these other things that when you're trained and you have a lot of experience that you know how to do. So that outward dimension, anyone who masters the art of Quranic recitation in an outward way, it facilitates understanding. This is the whole purpose of tajweed. This is the whole purpose of proper Quranic recitation, is to that bring about an understanding of the verses. But there's also an inward dimension of that. Our Prophet having a qira'ah mufassirah, is that as the companions would listen to the Prophet's recitation, is that they would be inspired with meaning of the meanings of the verses. And there are a few verses that our Prophet himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam did explain, but the vast majority he didn't. And that we have some of the great companions that transmitted the Quran, in particular that Ubay ibn Ka'ab, and that Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then the Tarjuman al-Quran, the great interpreter of the Quran, that Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, is that they were inspired with meanings of the verses because of not only the outward knowledge that they had, but also from praying behind Rasulullah. And still to this day, is that when you pray behind special people, that oftentimes meanings come into your heart praying behind these people, these special people, that wouldn't normally come to your heart if you're, for instance, playing it on a radio or on your sound system or something of that nature. And so that our Prophet ﷺ, that he would recite the Quran to the companions. But this also is indicative of something else. In relation to the Quran, the oral transmission precedes the written transmission. The oral transmission precedes the written transmission in terms of that chronology, but also in terms of that importance, is that the foundational recitation, the foundational transmission is an oral transmission, and it's buttressed and protected by the written transmission. That is the correct way to understand this. And so that this is, again, points to this same meaning of Islam having a living tradition. And so that we're not misunderstood, that we think of tradition in the sense of some type of cultural tradition of my parents did this so that I do this. We have pancakes on Saturday, so next Saturday when I'm older I'm going to always have pancakes. Not that type of tradition. Right? Tradition in that Latin sense of it's the root word of passing it down hand by hand, generation after generation, in that sense through the scholarly chains of transmission. And so that the oral transmission that is key is that you can't become an expert of Quran unless you spend an extended amount of time sitting at the feet of other experts who will rigorously correct you and hone your skills. And that I challenge the very best of any autodidact when it comes to the Quran, that is someone who's taught themselves how to recite Quran, to sit before a mid-range Quran expert. That someone that's considered to be an expert but is not one of the best. And to see if you can even get past Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. If you can, you probably are not going to get past the Fatiha. And that because of the clarity of how each letter which has a point of articulation, an exact place where it's supposed to be uttered from, and you're off in the slightest, is that they're trained to hear, is that the mistakes, and that they'll be able to, no, the dad can't be that far forward in your mouth. It has to be right in the middle, in the roof of your mouth, dad, and there's a specific way you have to move your cheeks and your tongue and so forth to get. Now, we do our best to recite, and as long as we're trying, is that Allah Ta'ala is the most forgiving of all of those who forgive. However, is that recitation of the Quran is very, very important. And again, that you will find people as well that, get a little bit funny when that hear master Quran reciters, and that the next question they might ask is, well, do they even know these meanings? They're reciting the Quran, but do they even know the meanings? Right? Learning the meanings of the Quran is a separate science. And just because you might have a great Quran reciter who doesn't know the meanings doesn't mean that we don't need both aspects of the Quran to be preserved. Is that we need people who can comment on its meanings, just as we need people who can, that preserve the outward dimension. And that even the outward dimension, though, cannot be understated. Because that once a language becomes, quote, dead, and what happens, the way that a language becomes dead is that it ceases to be spoken. It is impossible to bring that language back to life. You will never, ever definitively know that the way that language was pronounced. It's impossible, because it's an aspect of oral transmission. So the fact that we have, to this very day and age, people that recite the Quran with that much detail, that indicates is that this is the exact way that it was recited in the time of the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is incredible. It is really incredible. In other words, it's whenever you hear anyone recite, it's an echo, if you will, of the recitation of the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about whom Allah says in the Quran, is that we have facilitated it with your own tongue. Meaning that again, this idea of the oral transmission. And so, يَتْلُ عَلَيْكُمْ آيَاتِنَا وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ. And here, that Allah Ta'ala says now, and He purifies you. So, what's going to happen is that Allah is going to then speak about Him teaching you the Quran and the wisdom. But in this verse, is that He speaks here about that the Prophet purifying you. And what the ulama say, because if you compare this verse to when that it comes in the form that of on the tongue of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, that yuzakikum comes at the end, is that the scholars say is that here it's mentioned this way because this is the ultimate outcome of listening to the recitation of the Quran, learning it, and putting it into practice by way of wisdom, which is the sunnah, is that you eventually become purified. And so it's mentioned here because this is the whole point. When it comes in on the tongue of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, it's understood is that in terms of the actual order, is that tazkiyah is what comes at the end. And so it's either mentioned by way of primacy of what's actually sought or by the order and actually how it's done. But it's very clear. وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ. So then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is then purification? It's all meanings. It's all meanings of purification, outwardly and inwardly. And so that when Allah Ta'ala says in relation to our Prophet وَثِيَابَكَ فَتَحَّرْ, and your clothes, purify them. Purify your clothes. Again, that has an outward dimension and it has an inward dimension. And Imam Amin, I am sure, touched on a little bit of that earlier when he was speaking about purification. And so that this is the beauty of our deen, is that we are required to become pure outwardly, and that's an important dimension. But the more important dimension, and both are important, is the internal purity that we're supposed to achieve. And everything that we do outwardly is a mode and means of purifying us inwardly. So, وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ, and He was sent to purify you, that this is at the level of belief, at the level of practice, and at the level of the heart. So that at the level of the belief, that's obvious, to purify you from that false beliefs, from erroneous ways to understand the true nature of reality, that to purify us from that associating partners with Allah, attributing to Allah what is inappropriate. All of those meanings apply at the level of belief. And also it applies to everything that we believe about the prophets and everything that we believe about the end of the world and the next world, is to purify us from anything that would not be true. And if anyone has been involved in interfaith, and not to offend people of other faiths, but if anyone's been involved in interfaith, when you actually hear that other faiths describe what they believe about God, every time you just go away from those gatherings saying, Alhamdulillah ala ni'mat al-Islam wa kafa biha min ni'mah. I was recently at an interfaith event, and one of the questions that came towards the end of the Q&A session, which to me seemed like to be a very straightforward, easy question that every Muslim should be able, every religious person should be able to answer, that the lady who was moderating said, okay, there's a question that says, what is the purpose of life according to your religion? And there was like this pause, as if this was like some type of difficult question, right? That's the most important question in life, right? I mean, it relates to the most important questions in life, at least. And if we don't have an answer for that, we're in big trouble. Because that's what, if we can't answer that question, we are in big trouble. And the other two were struggling with the answer, and I was getting ready to answer, and she noticed they were struggling with the answer, so she said, okay, I'll let you think about that one, and then we'll come back to it. So we answered another question and came back to that, and to me it was just like, that's a very straightforward question. The purpose of life is to know Allah. End of story. What else has we been created? وَمَا خَلَقْنَا الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. What else is the purpose of life other than to know Allah? Everything that we believe, do, purification of the heart, all of the societal dimension of trying to rectify Allah Ta'ala's creation, rectify between people, service of creation, all of that ultimately is for what? It ultimately pertains to us coming to know Allah. And if we plant the seed of ma'rifah here in this dunya, then that will reap and sow that and harvest it in the next world. So to me it was a very easy question, and I was shocked at a couple of their answers. That the lack of clarity, and how that she even starts saying, well, if you need a few sentences, that's fine. And I was like, why do you need a few sentences? It's very, very easy. So our Prophet came, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to purify us. And all of the meanings of that purification, also outwardly, that the acts that we do, we want them to be pure acts. And that when you fall in line with the sacred law in Sharia, and your actions fall in line with in that sacred law, that they will maintain a purity as a result. They will preserve that purity that as a result of doing that. And this is why that we have to love the Sharia. We have to love the sacred law. We can't just see it as a bunch of rules to make things difficult on us. That we have to love the Sharia, because the Sharia is there to protect us. It's there to give us the boundaries so we know what's acceptable. It's there to teach us adab and etiquette with Allah Ta'ala. It's there to help us overcome the tendencies of our soul that will lead us astray and cause us destruction at times if we're not careful. The Sharia is beautiful, and it's a great blessing of Allah Ta'ala, and from the mercy of Allah that even if it's not being implemented around us, is that if someone was taken to court, it's not going to be Sharia that's implemented. And that almost every Muslim country, and almost every circumstance in every Muslim country, nor is Sharia being implemented in the Muslim world. However, is that our ability to the extent possible that to apply the Sharia to our own selves, this is a blessing. And that no one here is going to take you to task if you don't pay your zakat. But this is something that we should all do. We should all, that if you forget, know what is your date of paying zakat. Put it in your iCalendar or your Google Calendar, and remind yourself a week before that it's due. And get that notice, that on your message on your phone or whatever, that I have zakat due. And calculate what that zakat is, and to give it to people that are deserving of it. And so all of this will purify us. But here, which is the third dimension, if you will, of purification, pertains to the heart. And the heart is very important that it becomes purified, because as our Prophet told us, is that the heart is that organ in the body, is that it's very difficult to have purified actions if your heart is not purified. And you would be surprised about how many things people do outwardly that are stemming from an impure heart, and such that the things that they do outwardly are then tainted solely because of the state of the heart. And this is something that we have to become aware of and then dedicate our lives to. Is that it's fairly easy to learn the basics of creed to purify our belief. That it's a little bit more difficult, but still fairly easy to learn the basics of practice so that that actions become purified. And we might have to review that from time to time, and that if we enter into something new, that into business transactions or to marriage or something of that, that there's more that we have to learn. If there's new circumstances that arise, that there's new questions you might have to ask. But in particular, the heart, this is something that we have to struggle with in every single moment of our lives. In every single moment of our lives. And so in terms of importance, yes, everything is based upon correct belief, because if you have if you try to have purified actions and a pure heart without having correct belief, it's a problem, right? Because the belief is at the heart. But in terms of, if we define importance as how much we're in need of the science, there's no science that we are more in need of in every single moment, more than the science of the heart and how to purify it. So in other words, then we should accordingly spend time understanding the heart. And the heart is an ocean. And that there was a statement of one of the scholars to indicate to us the heart and its vastness. And that this is not a hadith, nor is it a verse in the Quran, but it's a scholarly statement of someone that had the veil removed, and he was able to witness how vast the heart is. And he gave an analogy that there is a relationship between a slight relationship between the word fu'ad and wad. Fu'ad is the heart, and wad is that a valley. And so fu'ad is one of the words of the heart. And in fact, that the Quran uses 4 words that refer to the heart. And I'll mention those 4, but actually I will say the following, is that when we speak about the internal dimension of the human being, is that you could refer to it collectively as heart. Your heart, meaning the internal dimension of the human being. And then that you could also say that you could use the heart specifically to refer to that the heart itself has 4 degrees, 1 degree of the heart itself. Or you could also use the word heart, that if you talk about the internal dimension of the human being and you juxtapose the heart to the intellect and to the spirit and the soul, the heart has something that has a particular function in relation to those others. Not to overly confuse you, but you could say the heart refers to everything within you. But if we're going to say that the heart has 4 degrees, and these are all Quranic terms, is that you have the word sadr, qalb, fu'ad, and lub, and they all mean heart in the broadest sense of the word. Is that sadr is your chest, but it's not your physical chest that's there with the ribs underneath. Right? Because when Allah says, Alam nashrah laka sadrak, have we not expanded your chest? It didn't mean that the Prophet's chest came out like this. Right? So obviously it's referring to something internally. And so the outermost dimension of the heart is your sadr. And then beneath that is what is called qalb. And beneath that is what is called, or you could say the layer beneath that is what is called fu'ad, the inner chamber of the heart. And then beneath that is what is called lub, which is the innermost core. So sadr, qalb, fu'ad, lub. All of that collectively is your heart. And just as your body is a composite, you have hands, you have arms, you have legs, you have arteries, you have a circulatory system, all this other type of stuff. And at the same time you say body. And your body is made up of multiple parts. Likewise, your heart has multiple layers, if you wish. And there's a really interesting book, for those of you who would like to read more about this, it's translated into English. It will be a bit austere and esoteric and a bit difficult to grasp and understand, but it's worth reading. It's been printed by, I believe, is it Islamic Text Society or Fons Vitae? And it's written by Hakim at-Tirmidhi. It's the text where there's actually 3 texts in one, but this particular book is written by Al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi, and it's called The Difference Between the Sadr, the Qalb, the Fu'ad, and the Lub. And so if anyone's interested in that the book is available. And what he does is he follows the verses in the Quran that pertain to the Sadr, the chest, and then explains how that dimension of the heart, there's certain things that relate to it. Then he follows the verses in the Quran that relate to Qalb, and he shows how those verses that are addressing that dimension of the heart, and then so forth and so on with the fu'ad and then the lub. And it's really, really interesting. And ultimately, even if we don't have a definitive knowledge about what the heart is, we know that it's something vast. And that this is why I went on this tangent, that the scholar said, one of the names of the heart is fu'ad. He says, in the fu'ad, in the heart, is al-fu'ad, is 1,000 valleys. And in each valley is al-fu'ad. Each valley has an additional 1,000 valleys. So that there's 1,000,000 valleys in the heart then. 1,000 times 1,000 is 1,000,000. In other words, is that the heart is vast. And that you could imagine that traveling, and that traveling, you enter into a new valley, you go over a mountain range, you enter into another valley, you go into another valley, and so forth, that there's a process of discovery and things that are in one valley that weren't in another valley. The point of that is that we take home is that the heart is vast, and the knowledge of it is extremely important. So in other words, that we have to go through a process of coming to understand our heart. And I'm also always amazed, just as I'm always amazed at people that ask questions about what else can we do for the Muslims besides making dua. That's a question you get all the time, as if that we are all making dua the way that we should. But that's a very common thing. What else can we do for the Muslims besides making dua? All right, there's a lot of things you can do along with dua, but we should make the foundation of everything we do rooted in dua first, and then do everything that we can, or simultaneously at least. But I'm always amazed at people that just all they do is they talk about the heart. All they do is they talk about the heart. Isn't there anything else that can be talked about? Sure, there's a lot of things that can be talked about. But that idea that you can just, talk about the heart and you're finished is to me very problematic. Because I personally believe that every khutbah should be related to the heart. That every lesson has to touch on the heart. Even if you're studying something else, it relates to the heart in one way or another. You have to relate it back to the heart. That if all of your action relates to your heart, that everything that you learn in the deen ultimately will relate back to the heart. And how could it not? If I just said the purpose of life is to know Allah, how do you know Allah? With your fingertip? Right? With your heart. The locus of ma'rifah, the locus, the seat, the place of knowledge of God is your heart. And so that this is the single most important thing that we could be doing. And it doesn't mean that we neglect other aspects. We do all of them together. However, is that if we don't focus on our heart, we are not focusing on that dimension of the human being, which in order for us to fulfill the purpose of life, that it needs to become purified. And so that this is why the heart is so, so, so important. And we know that the heart, that it has sins. Is that there's certain things that you simply can't do with your heart. And the scary thing is that some of these sins of the heart are major. They're major sins. And they're a big problem. And the ones that they mention that are the biggest of all the problems, which is what you will find, for those of you who have the text, on page 112 to 126, that Imam Al-Ghazali treats 3 main diseases of the heart. The first is hasad, which is envy. The second is riya, which is translated as ostentation. You know, what is ostentation? Right? I mean, that sounds a word that a lot of us, when we hear that it doesn't really strike a chord with us as English speakers oftentimes. And then the third is, although he says that there's 3 different ones, essentially, is that the third is kibr. It's arrogance or haughtiness or pride, however you choose to translate it, arrogance. And there's another one that's closely related to arrogance, but we'll talk about that when we talk about arrogance. So he takes here, what time do I have until, just so I can, 5:50? Oh, okay. So let's look at first this very severe disease of hasad. Hasad is envy. And this is pretty much a universal, spanning various religious traditions, spanning various cultural traditions, is that envy is a very real problem with humanity. And that some of them say that this was the foundational sin of humankind, because this is the sin of shaitan, Iblis, towards Adam. And from one perspective you could say it's arrogance, from another perspective you could say it's envy. And that to reconcile between the two, that you could say that it's could have been that arrogance that stemmed from that envy, or that the opposite. However, it's a very serious disease. And that what is its reality? Its reality is that where you feel this, what's called istithqal, you feel a heaviness that Allah Ta'ala has given someone else a blessing. And understanding why it's so grave is in the very thing that was just mentioned. You feel a heaviness that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, Rabbul Izzah, who gives whom He pleases, what He pleases, a blessing. And Allah says in the Quran, أَمْ يَحْسَدُونَ النَّاسِ عَلَى مَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Are they going to show envy towards a people that Allah has given from His own bounty? So if we don't think about our own selves for a minute, is that Allah gives His fadl, His bounty, to whom He pleases. Okay. Allah is just with everyone. Everyone at least will be dealt with justice. Everyone will be dealt with at least justice. And why I say at least is that no one will be wronged by Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Yawm al-Qiyamah, that in one of the two final abodes where every person will end up, no one will say that I've been dealt with unjustly. When the veil is removed and basaruka al-yawma hadid, and you have clear vision, no one will ever say that they've been dealt with unjustly. Impossible. Allah Ta'ala, that it's impossible for Him to be unjust. Tabarak wa Ta'ala. But He gives His fadl to whom He pleases. He gives His bounty and shows His grace to whom He pleases. And so you could have two people that do the exact same thing. One person, Allah Ta'ala gives him 10 times the reward, and the other person He gives 300 times the reward. And you can't say that Allah dealt with them unjustly, because both of them already got actually more than they deserved. Because at very least, al-hasanatu bi'ashri amthaliha, every good deed Allah will recompense tenfold. So you're already getting much more than you deserve. But then even bringing into question the idea of deserving is something else altogether, and something else much more profound and much more deep. That if we can understand that concept, then there's very few things that will ever, very few problems we'll ever have with religion, in terms of accepting the sacred law, and even understanding some of the difficult theological issues that have led so many people in our days to that leave religion altogether. Big questions like the problem of evil. If we can understand this claim of human beings that we actually deserve something, and we can come to terms with that, and we can treat that in our own hearts, then there's, as a result of that spiritual state that will come in the heart, there's almost no intellectual hang-ups that you will have as a result. But if we don't go that deep and take it back to just this basic level, and understand that Allah gives His bounty to whom He pleases, and just because He gives more to one person, that you cannot say that that's unjust. Why? Because He does what He pleases. He's not asked about what He does. We are the ones who are asked. So what should be the default natural response if you know that you're a slave and servant of Allah, and your Lord decreed that so-and-so would get such and such a blessing? What should be the natural fitrah response? Allahu Akbar. You should be happy. Why? Because it's the decree of Allah. Allah chose that so-and-so attain this or be given this. Your default state should be, if your heart is pure, would be one of farh. You'd be happy. And you would have contentment. And if I can speak about it in a positive sense, is that there is a way for you to be able to receive blessings in the plural from every blessing that Allah Ta'ala has ever given to anyone or anything. And it's by having the trait of rida, of contentment with the divine decree in your heart. By you being content that Allah made the Prophet ﷺ the greatest of the prophets and messengers, just having that in your heart, that you're like, Alhamdulillah, and you're happy because that was the divine will, Allah will give you the greatest portion of connection to that Prophet in yufid alayk, and flow from the divine effulgence to you, from the outpour of His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result of being content with that. Or any other blessing that Allah has given to anyone else or anything else. That contentment is a means for you to benefit from everything. And you will benefit it in ways that are immense. Allah Ta'ala will raise you in degrees through these traits of heart in ways that you will never get raised by anything that you do outwardly. This is the secret, is that we're 1,000 people to do the exact same amount of worship outwardly. How would they then differ? They would differ by the state of their heart. They would differ by then the actions of their heart. They would differ then by their degrees of shuhud, their degrees of witnessing, and all of these other things that ultimately pertain to the heart. If we want to rise to the degree of the sabiqeen and the muqarrabeen, is that we do so by way of heart. And you could actually have someone that has much less worship than someone outwardly, but they have a much higher degree of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of the state of their heart. And so envy is disgusting and filthy, because what are you essentially doing? You puny nothing are questioning the Lord of the worlds and His decree. You're questioning the divine decree when we envy. We are questioning the divine decree if we envy. And so then is that how do we then rid ourselves of this? The very first step is to be aware of how disgusting it is. Secondly, it's to be aware of what is its reality. Its reality is that heaviness, is that you want that blessing removed from that person. And the worst type of envy is that you don't even want the blessing. You're just grumpy. You don't want anyone to have a blessing. And there's, unfortunately, for pure hearts, it's difficult to understand that. Right? There's some grumpy people out there that they're just not happy. They're miserable in their life, and they don't want anyone else to be happy. Anyone gets a blessing. They don't even want children. This person gets children, and they are happy. They're retired. They're going to die soon. But someone gets a nice job, right? In a dunyawi sense. Or someone is, whatever, affecting a lot of people or whatever, and they just don't like it. There's some grumpy people out there, unfortunately. And that's the worst type of envy of all. And then there's another degree of envy as well, where there's something that you want. And oftentimes when it could be related to something outward, right? Is that man is more handsome than I am. He has a better physique than I do. He's more athletic than me. Or that other sister, she's more beautiful than I am. Or this or that. Or there's two positions and this guy got the job and he didn't get the promotion. This guy got the job, he didn't. He got a promotion, he didn't. This person's closer to this person than that person. This person got married and I didn't get married. Right? All of these types of things where apparently outwardly that it's either or. Either one person gets it or the other does. And that this type of envy especially shows with colleagues, people that are close. That it's very rare to have envy about someone who's like way above you. Right? The CEO gets, more stock options or whatever. Very rarely will someone much lower than him have envy towards the CEO. But anyhow, it usually happens with people that are somewhere that near you. And so when that happens, you have to recognize is that that fiery-like feeling that comes to your heart, that heaviness that comes to your heart as a result of that blessing, is that you have to recognize that's envy. And the very first thing you have to do is dislike that. And if you dislike that, it's an atonement for it, right? By disliking it. And ideally, you should also say astaghfirullah. You should repent for it, okay? And that's not the only step, because if you do that, it's sufficient for the moment. But what we're talking about is in the future how to remove it completely from your heart. How to remove it completely then is that every time that it happens to you, that you all of a sudden make dua for that person. That if you know that there's two people, both of them want to get married, one is about to get married, is that you make dua for them. Oh Allah, bless them with this. Oh Allah, bless them with it. Oh Allah, da 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 da. Right? bless them, bless. You make dua for the person that you have envy for, that they actually attain what it is that you yourself want or even don't want. And that even if it's difficult at first, make dua. Make dua. And then the long-term way to completely purify your heart is by what is called tahqiq al-ubudiyah. Is to actualize your servitude to Allah. And when you become a pure servant of Allah, is that you become so preoccupied with Allah's blessings upon you. And you reach such a state of submission to Allah Ta'ala, is that it doesn't affect you. And in fact, that you actually want other people, right, to receive immense blessings. And a practical way to attain this, just so someone doesn't think, oh, I'm never going to attain that, that's for these people that lived 700 years ago. No. There's a practical way where every night, if you do this, you will find very soon is that your heart is flushed out. Imagine before you go to bed every night, some of the things that you really, really want. Really, really want. And imagine that your arch enemy, or someone you really don't like, imagine them attaining what you really want. And see the state of your heart. What is the natural reaction? Or your greatest competitor, or that person you don't like at work, or whatever. And then, all of a sudden, force yourself to want good for them, and to desire good for them, and then force yourself to make dua for them. If you do this consistently, you will find that eventually, your natural state will be that default state of just purity, where you are happy that everyone that is receiving blessings. And then that you realize is that the outward dimension, your iman will go so strong because a lot of these problems, religion is healthy if it's applied correctly. Your worldly life will be filled, it will be much more healthy if you practice your religion carefully and you focus on it. And that you will find that by you desiring good for other people, a lot of the problems that you create for yourself, you won't have. Because the envious person loses twofold. One, it doesn't mean that Allah Ta'ala is going to withhold for that person you're envying. Two, you always will be miserable. You will always be miserable. Because Allah keeps giving His blessings to more and more people, to more and more people, to more and more people. And that, you know, this is really what we should be striving for, is just that happy that people are receiving the divine bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, envy. Then we also have this disease of riya. And I forgot to mention that these three diseases of the heart, which are detailed in the book that hopefully you all purchase, or at least access, if we can get a hold of these three, in other words, that if we can work on these three, all the other diseases of the heart become easier to manage. Just as if we look at the physical limbs, the most difficult limb is the one that Imam Amin talked about earlier, which is the tongue. If we can get a hold of our tongue, that controlling our eyes, ears, and the other limbs are easier. That the tongue is to the rest of the limbs what these three diseases are to the rest of the diseases of the heart. This is the secret of controlling and putting our heart in purifying the heart. So then you have that what is called riya, which is ostentation, showing off. It's a form of hypocrisy. Is that what essentially that are you doing? Is that you are doing things for other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I will try to be very brief here to speak about the various degrees of the heart. And I'm going to, of ostentation rather. And part of doing this is not to overwhelm you, but it's to prove to you exactly why what I mentioned in the beginning is so important. You have to dedicate your life to this. Because it doesn't happen overnight. Your heart just doesn't, I mean, it's possible. You wake up and you have a pure heart. But for the most part, it's not like that. You have to struggle with these things. But you first have to be convinced that it's important. If you're not convinced that it's important, you will go through life neglecting your heart. And if you neglect your heart, entropy takes over, and your heart will be in a state of disarray. And that the more you neglect it, just as the more you would neglect yourself, if you didn't cut your fingernails for a long time, what would happen? If you didn't take a shower, what would happen? Likewise, if you don't flush your heart out, what's going to happen? That you're going to get cobwebs and spiderwebs, and rust is going to grow, and there's going to be dirt and dust and all kinds of horrible things. And that we have to cleanse it out. And so that ostentation essentially is doing things for other than the sake of Allah. And it's a process whereby we become more and more pure. From the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that the scholars that speak about sincerity, and that the ideal is to be sincere when we start an act, maintain that sincerity during the act, and that remain sincere even after the act. And the ideal is that we have no other ulterior motives whatsoever, except that only thing that we want from any act or worship or otherwise that we do, and everything could be ultimately an act of worship, is to draw near to Allah Ta'ala. Meaning that we connect that intention to Allah. We want reward from Allah. We want to draw near to Allah. We want to attain the contentment of Allah. That we want to gaze upon the noble countenance of Allah. That's sincerity. But then because of our nafs, and as we were mentioning earlier, the nature of the dunya, all manifestations of the lack of sincerity pertain to dunya. And ultimately, it really is about people. So we have to understand and learn to distance ourselves inwardly from what people think, or seeking what is in their hands. All manifestations of insincerity relate ultimately to the world and other people. Because it could also relate to money. It could relate to things of this nature, that possessions and things like this. But generally speaking, that it relates to people. And so that learning to become sincere is a process of learning of doing things solely for the sake of Allah Ta'ala. So the 4 degrees of ostentation are as follows. Actually, you could mention 5, but this is where it's just sheer hypocrisy. If you don't believe at all, and the only reason that you do something is that for someone else, and you really don't believe in all, that's obviously hypocrisy. That's someone's a hypocrite. But let's say that there's something that you want to do that were there to be no people there, you would never do it, but there's people there and all of a sudden you do it. Okay, that's the most apparent degree of riya. Then there's something more subtle, is that whether people are there or not, you do what it is that you're doing. However, if people are present, you have more energy to do what it is that you're doing. So you're really tired and you're ready to fall asleep and there's people present, all of a sudden you have all of this energy to pray. It's a sign that we need to work with our sincerity. You do say that someone's doing their worship, whether people are present, they're worshiping Allah sincerely, that they would do the act whether or not people were there. But after they do the act, is that they know that someone came to find out that they did something, and they become happy. Why are we becoming happy? Sign of riya. We should not be happy. If there's worship that we're doing, people might find out, but we should not be happy that people are finding it out. And then even more subtle than that is that where people have that expectations that people treat them a certain way because of something that they do. So they expect people to send salams to them first. They expect people that make room for them and all these other types of things. And Taysir is standing there, so he's making me go quickly. That is the most subtle form of riya. And then that the way that we ultimately overcome riya is reminding ourselves constantly about our belief in Allah Ta'ala, and that nothing else matters ultimately from creation or what other people think other than Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Constantly reminding ourselves that Allah Ta'ala is gazing upon us. More could be said about that. Then we have one of the worst diseases of all, which is kibr, which is arrogance. And that arrogance is where you actually think you're better than someone else. And it's sufficient for us to know that we began as a drop of fluid, and that we will end as a putrid corpse. In between these two states, that we carry excrement and we use the bathroom. It's always amazing for someone that uses the bathroom and we all do, that how we could ever be arrogant is that arrogance is sheer foolishness, and it will block someone from the truth. And so that the way that we overcome our arrogance is to reflect deeply upon our origins, to reflect deeply upon our ending. And how could anyone, when we reflect upon our origins and our ending, that ever have arrogance? We should reflect on the fact that the arrogant will be raised like ants on the day of judgment, and they will be toppled and walked upon. And that those that are arrogant Allah will wage war against them, because that they are trying to vie with Allah with something that is solely His. On the contrary, that we should be humble, and that if we have problems with arrogance, we really think that we're better than other people, that we should force ourselves to do the acts of the humble, and that remind ourselves of our origin, and that we don't know that who is really beloved to Allah and who is not, and that our Prophet was the most humble of people despite being the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that you combat arrogance with humility. So that these three diseases, that if we can get a hold of them, that inshallah ta'ala, that Allah ta'ala will facilitate for us and make easy for us that purifying our heart from the rest. May Allah ta'ala purify our hearts. May Allah ta'ala that bless our hearts, and that completely cleanse them, and to prepare all of our hearts, inshallah ta'ala, for that which we are created, to be able to reflect the true nature of reality and to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Jazakumullah khairan. Sorry, Shaykh Yahya, for standing up. We have to move quickly to dinner, which we have only about 50 minutes for. So